The whiskey in Reese Ford's glass was the color of tired sunlight, and it tasted like regret. He nursed it slowly, making it last. In a town like Redemption Gulch, a man alone needed to make things last. His money, his luck, and most of all, his anonymity. The saloon air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and the quiet desperation of men who had nowhere else to be. For Reese, it was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where his past was just a low hum beneath the noise, not a scream in his ear. He sat with his back to the wall, a habit forged in a life he was trying to forget, his gaze distant, fixed on the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. He'd been a lot of things in his 35 years, none of them good. Now, he was trying to be nothing at all. Then the batwing doors flew open with a violent crash, slapping against the outer walls. The lazy chatter of the saloon died instantly. Framed in the brutal glare of the street stood a girl. She couldn't have been more than 17, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair a wild tangle of sun-bleached straw. But it was her face that stole the breath from every man in the room. A crimson smear ran from her temple down her cheek, stark and wet against her pale skin. Her eyes, wide with a terror that seemed too big for her slender frame, darted around the room, searching, pleading. They passed over the card players frozen mid-deal, the bartender with a rag poised in his hand. And then they found Reese. They locked onto him, and for a reason he would never understand, they stayed. She stumbled forward, a broken bird seeking refuge from a storm. Before he could react, she was at his feet, collapsing against his legs, her small hands clutching the rough denim of his trousers. "Please," she choked out, the word a ragged sob. "Don't let him take me. For the love of God, sir, please." Behind her, a second figure filled the doorway, casting a long, sharp shadow that cut across the floor. He was a man of substance, his tailored coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the grit of the town. His face was florid with rage, a vein throbbing in his thick neck. Bartholomew Finch, the mayor, a man who owned nearly everything in Redemption Gulch, including the law. "There you are, you little gutter snipe," Finch boomed, his voice oozing a proprietary fury. He pointed a gloved finger at the girl cowering at Reese's feet. "Get up. You're coming with me. Now." Reese didn't move. He felt the girl's body trembling against him, the desperate, frantic pulse of her life. He looked from her terrified face up to the mayor's sneering contempt. Every instinct, honed by years of violence and self-preservation, screamed at him to push her away, to fade back into the shadows, and let this play out. It wasn't his fight. He wasn't a hero. Heroes ended up dead. Or worse. They ended up like him, haunted by the ghosts of those they couldn't save. But then Finch took a step forward, his hand reaching for the girl, and something inside Reese snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a current. An old and terrible instinct reawakened not for malice, but for something else entirely. He saw the ghosts of his past in her eyes. Every failure, every life he'd taken or failed to protect. He could not be nothing. Not today. His hand moved with a speed that was bone deep. A muscle memory he had prayed was gone forever. The heavy Colt Peacemaker felt like a part of him as it cleared the holster. The action was fluid, economical, deadly. Finch's eyes widened in disbelief, his hand frozen in midair. The saloon was so quiet you could hear the girl's ragged breath. The shot was a deafening crack that shattered the silence into 1,000 pieces. It was a sound that had defined Reese's life. Mayor Finch staggered back, a perfect dark hole appearing in the center of his pristine white shirt. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his fall heavy and final. The silence that followed was worse than the shot. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief. Then, a whisper from the bar, spreading like fire in dry grass. God Almighty. He shot the mayor. Reese looked down at the smoking gun in his hand, then at the dead man on the floor, and finally at the girl whose eyes were now wide with a different kind of shock. In the space of a single heartbeat, he had traded his quiet anonymity for the hangman's noose. His past had finally caught him, not with a whisper, but with a roar. He didn't know the girl's name or why the mayor of Redemption Gulch was chasing her through the street. He only knew one thing. They had to run. Reese grabbed the girl's arm, hauling her to her feet. "Come on," he rasped, his voice raw. The saloon was a tableau of frozen figures, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. That wouldn't last. Soon, shock would curdle into outrage, and outrage would form a mob. He shoved his Colt back into its holster and dragged her toward the rear exit, his mind already calculating. His horse, Shadow, was tied out back. One horse. 2 people. It was a fool's chance. They burst out into the alley, the stench of refuse and stale beer assaulting them. Reese vaulted onto Shadow's back, the worn leather of the saddle a familiar, grounding presence. He reached down, his hand clamping around the girl's wrist. Up. Now. She was nimble, fueled by adrenaline, scrambling up behind him without a word. He didn't wait for her to get settled. He dug his heels into Shadow's flanks, and the powerful stallion leapt forward, churning up dust and debris. They galloped out of the alley and veered away from the main street, the sound of a bell beginning to toll an alarm behind them. It was a frantic, angry sound, the voice of the town calling for his blood. He pushed Shadow harder, heading east, toward the jagged, sun-scorched expanse of the Badlands. It was no place for anyone to be, let alone on one horse with no supplies. But it was their only hope. The winding canyons and treacherous terrain offered concealment that the open plains did not. For hours, they rode in silence, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the harsh gasp of their own breathing. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on them, leaching the moisture from their bodies. Reese could feel the girl's small frame pressed against his back, her hands clutching his shirt. She was a featherweight, yet her presence felt heavier than stone. He was acutely aware of every tremor that ran through her, a constant reminder of the life he had just irrevocably tied to his own. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, he finally slowed Shadow to a walk, the animal's sides heaving. They were deep in the labyrinth of rock and shadow now. He found a small overhang, a shallow cut in a rock face that offered meager shelter. He slid from the saddle, his muscles screaming in protest, and then helped the girl down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her, his hands steady on her arms. "Easy," he said, the first word he'd spoken to her in hours. She looked up at him, her face pale in the fading light. The blood on her cheek had dried to a dark crust. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He hesitated. The name he carried was a curse, a name whispered with fear in some corners and hatred in others. For a moment, he considered lying, giving her a common name that would offer them both a clean slate. But he owed her the truth. He had killed for her. She deserved to know whose brand she now carried. Reese Ford. He saw no flicker of recognition in her eyes, and for that, he was grateful. "I'm Annalise," she offered softly. There was no more to say. The darkness deepened around them, bringing a deceptive chill to the air. Reese unsaddled Shadow, rubbing the weary horse down with a handful of dry grass. He had a canteen, barely half full, and a few strips of jerky in his saddlebags. a pathetic provision for a desperate flight. He offered the canteen to Annalise first. She took a small sip, her eyes never leaving his, then handed it back. He drank sparingly, the lukewarm water doing little to quench the fire in his throat. He built no fire. The light would be a beacon to any posse, and he had no doubt a posse was coming. Bartholomew Finch was a man of power. His death would not go unanswered. As the last light died, a profound silence descended, the kind of absolute quiet that feels loud. It was broken by a small, hitching sound. Annalise had curled up against the rock wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she was crying, not loudly, but in small, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Reese stood awkwardly for a moment, the jerky feeling like ash in his mouth. He was a man of action, of violence and flight. He didn't know how to navigate the geography of another person's grief. He sat down a few feet away from her, his back against the rough stone, his rifle across his lap. He kept his watch, his senses tuned to the night, but his thoughts were on the crying girl. He had saved her from the mayor, but he had dragged her into his own world of running and fear. The memory of the gunshot echoed in the vast, empty landscape, a sound that had bought her freedom, but cost them both everything. They found a more defensible shelter the following night, a shallow cave carved into the side of a canyon by wind and time, its mouth partially obscured by a cluster of stubborn, thorny bushes. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, offering little light and no comfort. This time, Reese risked a small fire, tucked deep inside the cave where its glow would be invisible from the canyon floor. The crackle of burning mesquite was a fragile shield against the immense, predatory silence of the Badlands. The meager flames cast flickering shadows on the cave walls, making them dance like ancient spirits. The heat was a welcome relief from the biting night air. Annalise sat huddled close to the warmth, her arms wrapped around her knees, the same position she'd taken the night before. But tonight, the shuddering sobs were gone, replaced by a tense, brittle stillness. Reese sat across from her, cleaning his Colt with a practiced, meticulous motion. The ritual was calming, the familiar weight of the steel, the scent of the gun oil, the precise click of the cylinder spinning back into place. He finished his task and looked up to find her watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. The dried blood was still on her face. There had been no water to spare for washing. It was a stark reminder of the violence that had thrown them together. "He hit me," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "That's how it started. He hit me, and I ran." Reese stopped what he was doing, giving her his full attention. He had assumed as much, but hearing her say it aloud gave the act a new, sharper reality. He simply nodded, letting her speak. It was her story to tell, in her own time. He wasn't supposed to be like that," she continued, her gaze dropping to the flames. "After my parents passed, the law said he was my guardian. Mayor Finch. He was supposed to look after our property, our ranch." She clutched a small, simple locket that hung around her neck, a habit he'd noticed before. "He said my parents had debts, that the ranch would have to be sold to cover them. I didn't believe him. Papa was a careful man." She took a shaky breath. "Yesterday, he brought the papers to the house. He said I had to sign the deed over to him, that it was the only way. When I refused, he changed." Her voice trembled, and she unconsciously touched the crusted blood on her temple. "He said a girl like me had no choice, that he would take what was his, one way or another. I threw a lantern at him and ran out the back door. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just ended up in that saloon." Reese listened, his expression unreadable, but inside, a slow, cold anger was building. This was not a simple chase. It was not about a runaway ward. It was about greed. It was about a powerful man trying to steal a dead family's legacy from their orphaned daughter. The man he had shot was not just a pursuer. He was a vulture. "The inheritance," Reese said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "What did your parents leave you?" Annalise shook her head, a look of confusion on her face. "That's the thing. We weren't rich. Just the ranch. Some cattle. It's good land, Papa always said. Blessed with a strong spring, but it's not something a man like Mayor Finch would go to such lengths for. Not unless—" She trailed off, her brow furrowed in thought. "Not unless there's something about it he knew. And I don't—" The revelation settled between them, heavy and dangerous. Reese's understanding of the single violent act in the saloon shifted on its axis. He hadn't just reacted to a moment of injustice. He had stumbled into the middle of a war he didn't understand. And by killing the general of one side, he had made himself the sole protector of the other. His guilt over the killing didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new, unfamiliar feeling. Purpose. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was running toward a future that was inextricably linked with the safety of the girl in front of him, and the secret her family had died to protect. He looked at Annalise, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just a terrified child, but a flicker of her father's careful nature, her mother's resilience. She was stronger than she knew. "Get some sleep," he said, his tone softer than he intended. "I'll take the watch." As she settled down, turning her back to the fire, Reese stared into the flames. The world was no longer divided into his past and his desperate present. Now, there was a third, unexpected territory, a fight that wasn't his, but one he would see through to the end, miles away, in the pre-dawn chill. Deputy Gideon Cole knelt and studied the ground. Where another man would see only rock and dust, Cole saw a story. He saw the faint scuff of a boot heel, the displaced pebble, the almost invisible print of a shod horse carrying the weight of 2 riders. He rose, his face a mask of grim determination. He was a tall, lean man, all sinew and bone, with eyes the color of a winter sky. He wasn't just a lawman. He was a predator, and his prey was Reese Ford. Cole had been 20 miles away when the news of Mayor Finch's death reached him, but he knew before the messenger even finished speaking. He knew who would be bold enough, fast enough, and foolish enough to gun down a man like Finch in broad daylight. Reese Ford. The name was a shard of glass in Cole's memory. Years ago, in a different town, a bank robbery had gone wrong. Reese's gang, and Cole's older brother, a newly deputized lawman, caught in the crossfire. Cole had been the one to find him, bleeding out in the street. He'd sworn an oath over his brother's body that day. He would see Reese Ford at the end of a rope. Finch's death wasn't justice in Cole's eyes. It was an opportunity. A legal, righteous excuse to unleash a very personal hunt. He knew the Badlands. He had tracked Apache raiders and desperate outlaws through this unforgiving maze before. And he knew Reese's mind. Reese would be clever. He would use the terrain, double back, try to throw him off. Cole spurred his horse on, a cold smile touching his lips. It was a challenge he welcomed. Reese felt him before he saw him. It was a prickle on the back of his neck, a change in the air. For 2 days they had pushed deeper into the Badlands, the terrain growing more hostile, their water almost gone. But this new feeling was a different kind of danger. On the 3rd morning, as the sun crested a distant mesa, Reese saw it, a lone rider, far behind them but moving with a steady, relentless purpose. "We've got company," he said to Annalise, his voice flat. She looked back, her hand shielding her eyes. "Just one man?" "One is all it takes." if it's the right one. Reese didn't need to see the man's face to know who it was. The way he rode, the way he seemed to merge with the landscape. It was the mark of a master tracker. It had to be Cole. News traveled fast, and vengeance traveled faster. To keep them alive, to keep Annalise safe, Reese had to become the man he had tried to bury. He could no longer be the quiet drifter. He had to resurrect the cold, calculating survivor who had once led a gang. His movements became sharper, his decisions quicker, his eyes harder. He led them through a narrow, winding canyon, knowing the rock walls would echo and distort sound, making it harder for Cole to pinpoint their location. He had Annalise dismount and walk beside him on a stretch of flat rock, while he led Shadow along the edge, leaving a single set of tracks that would hopefully confuse and slow their pursuer. Annalise watched the transformation in him with a mixture of fear and awe. The gentle, haunted man who had shared his water with her was gone, replaced by this formidable stranger. He moved with a lethal grace, his senses on a razor's edge. He would stop, listen to the wind, study the flight of a hawk, then change direction without a word of explanation. She saw the shadow of his past self, the gunslinger of whispers and legends, and she understood why men like Mayor Finch would fear him. But she also knew that this dangerous efficiency, this cold focus, was all for her. He was using the darkness of his past to shield her future. That evening, he set a trap, not a deadly one, but a snare of misdirection. He found a place where the trail split, one path leading into an open-ended box canyon, a dead end. The other, barely visible, led up a steep, treacherous rockfall. It was a risk. If Shadow stumbled, they were finished. He lit a small fire at the entrance to the box canyon, leaving behind their near-empty canteen and a piece of discarded jerky, a sign of a hasty, desperate camp. Then, with painstaking effort, he erased their tracks leading toward the rockfall. From a high ledge, hidden in the deep shadows of dusk, they watched. Hours passed. Then, they saw him. The lone rider, Gideon Cole, dismounted at the fork in the trail. He studied the ground, then the fire. He moved with the patient certainty of a wolf. After a long moment, he took the bait, leading his horse into the box canyon. Reese pulled Annalise back from the ledge. "Let's go. That bought us a few hours. No more." As they carefully led Shadow up the treacherous rockfall, Annalise risked a glance at Reese's face, illuminated by the faint starlight. The hardness was still there, but she saw something else in his eyes, the terrible weight of dredging up a self he despised, all to honor a promise he'd never spoken aloud. Gideon Cole's frustration was a cold, sharp stone in his gut. The box canyon had been a trick, an old one, but cleverly executed. It had cost him the better part of the night. He stood at the base of the rockfall Reese and Annalise had climbed, staring up at the difficult path. Ford was better than he remembered, more disciplined, less reckless. The presence of the girl had changed him, sharpened him. Cole remounted, his jaw tight. This was no longer just a hunt. It was a battle of wills. Meanwhile, Reese and Annalise had found a temporary refuge in a place that felt like the end of the world, a cluster of wind-hollowed caves nestled high on a desolate mesa. From here, they could see for miles in every direction. It was a good vantage point, but it was also a trap. There was no way out except the way they had come in. Their water was gone. Their bodies were screaming with exhaustion and dehydration. Hope was a dying ember. Annalise sat huddled against the rock, her throat too dry to speak. Her fingers, as they had done so many times, went to the locket around her neck. It was her last connection to her parents, to the life that had been stolen from her. She flicked it open, not to look at the space where a portrait should be, but just to feel it. As her thumb traced the inside edge, she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible looseness in the metal backing. Her heart fluttered. With trembling fingers, she pried at the edge. It gave way, revealing a minuscule, hollow compartment. Tucked inside was a tightly folded square of paper, yellowed with age. She unfolded it with the care of a scholar handling a sacred text. It wasn't a map or a letter. It was a drawing. A simple, hand-sketched image of a lone rock formation, a spire that looked like a needle, and next to it, a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, the old surveyor's mark for a spring. Below it were 3 words. "Look beneath the hearth." She showed it to Reese. He stared at the paper, his parched lips parted. A spring. It was a miracle. But the rock formation was one he recognized. They had passed it a day ago, miles back in the direction they had come from, back toward Cole. It was an abandoned homestead, a collapsed ruin of stone and timber he'd dismissed as worthless. "The hearth," Annalise whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Our old ranch house has a hearth of fieldstone, but this is something else." The choice was no choice at all. To stay on the mesa was to die of thirst. To go back was to walk into the path of their hunter. But the paper was a message from the grave, a final piece of guidance from her father. It was a risk they had to take. They traveled by night, conserving what little energy they had left, their movements slow and agonizing. They found the needle-like spire of rock standing like a lonely sentinel against the moonlit sky. Nearby were the ruins of the homestead, little more than a foundation and a collapsed chimney stack. The stone hearth was still mostly intact, working together, using a piece of splintered roof timber as a lever. They pried at the heavy flagstones of the hearth. The work was brutal, their muscles screaming in protest. Finally, one of the stones shifted. Beneath it was not a spring, but a dark, hollow space. Reaching inside, Reese's fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled out a heavy tin lockbox, rusted at the hinges. It wasn't locked. With bated breath, Annalise lifted the lid. It contained no gold, no jewels, no sack of coins. It contained a book, a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with her father's neat, precise handwriting. But the words told a story of pure ugliness. It was Mayor Finch's secret account book. For years, her father, a man trusted for his quiet nature and honesty, had been forced by Finch to keep his books, not just the town's official records, but these, the real ones. Page after page detailed a sprawling enterprise of corruption, extortion schemes, illegal land grabs funded by railroad money, cattle rustling operations where Finch took a cut, bribes paid to territorial judges. It was a detailed map of the rot that festered beneath the surface of Redemption Gulch. And on the last few pages, a new entry. Annalise. Finch grows impatient. He knows about the spring on our land. The railroad will pay a fortune for the water rights. He means to have it all. I have hidden this book. If you are reading this, I have failed. Trust no one. The words hit them with the force of a physical blow. Her parents hadn't just died, they had been silenced. And her inheritance wasn't just a ranch. It was this book, this proof, this weapon. In that moment, everything changed. They were no longer fugitives running from a killing. They were custodians of a truth that could burn Finch's entire empire to the ground. Reese looked at Annalise, whose face was a mask of grief and steely resolve. He looked at the ledger in his hands. The weight of it was far heavier than the weight of his gun. He had killed a man to save a girl. Now, he held the power to kill a legacy of lies. Their desperate flight for survival was over. A purposeful journey for justice was about to begin. The discovery of the ledger settled a new kind of quiet between them. It was not the strained silence of fear, but the heavy silence of purpose. They found the spring, a trickle of clear, cold water seeping from the rocks behind the ruined homestead, just as the symbol had promised. They drank deeply, the life-giving water a balm to their bodies and souls. It felt like a baptism. That night, under a canopy of brilliant stars, they sat by a real fire, the ledger resting between them like a sacred object. The choice they faced was as vast and stark as the landscape around them. They could take the book, ride west, and never look back. Find a new territory, a new life. Let Redemption Gulch fester in its own corruption. It was the safe choice, the logical one. Reese, the survivor, knew it was the path to a long life. But he looked at Annalise. The firelight played across her face, and he no longer saw the terrified girl who had collapsed at his feet. He saw a woman forged in grief and fire, her jaw set with a resolve that mirrored his own. Her family's name, her parents' honor, was inked in that book. To run would be to dishonor their final, desperate act of defiance. "My father tried to fight him," she said softly, her hand resting on the ledger's worn leather cover. "He failed. I can't let his fight be for nothing." Reese watched her, and the last vestiges of the man who wanted to be nothing finally crumbled to dust. For years, he had been running from the ghost of who he was, a man of violence, a man whose actions brought death. He saw now that redemption wasn't found in running away from your past, but in turning to face it and making it mean something. Killing Finch had been an instinct. Returning to face the consequences, armed with this truth, would be a choice. It was a chance not to erase the red from his ledger, but to balance it with something righteous. "We go back," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a vow. A sad smile touched Annalise's lips. "He'll be waiting. That deputy." "Cole." "I know," Reese said. He picked up his Colt, which he had cleaned and oiled by the spring. He checked the action, his movements deliberate. He wasn't the same man who had drawn this weapon in the saloon. The gunslinger had been driven by ghosts and reflex. This man was driven by conviction. The gun felt different in his hand, not a tool of survival, but an instrument of justice. It was a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. Their ride back was a reversal of their desperate flight. They were no longer prey scurrying for cover. They moved with a steady, determined pace, their path direct. They didn't hide from the horizon. They rode toward it. The landscape that had been their enemy now felt like a witness, the ancient rocks and silent mesas watching them pass. Two small figures on a collision course with destiny. During the ride, a new intimacy grew between them. They spoke of her parents, of the ranch she remembered, the smell of her mother's baking and the sound of her father's laugh. He found himself speaking of his own childhood, of a life before the guns, small memories he thought he had buried forever. They were no longer just a protector and his ward. They were partners, bound by a shared ordeal and a common cause. The unspoken trust had found its voice. On the final morning, they stopped on a ridge overlooking Redemption Gulch. The town looked peaceful from a distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in the valley, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. "Are you afraid?" Annalise asked. Reese looked at the town, then at her. "I am," he admitted, the confession costing him nothing. "But for the first time in a long time, it's not the only thing I feel." He spurred Shadow forward, and they began the slow descent into the valley. They would not sneak into town under the cover of darkness. They would ride in at high noon, down the center of the main street, with the truth held firmly in their hands. They were riding into the heart of the lie, ready to tear it out. The bell in the town church had just begun to toll for noon when two riders appeared at the end of Redemption Gulch's main street. The sight of them brought the town to a standstill. Faces appeared in windows. Men stepped out of the saloon and the general store, their hands hovering near their hips. It was Reese Ford and the girl, Annalise. But they weren't running. They rode slowly, deliberately, their heads held high, dust cloaking them like apostles from the desert. They didn't stop until they reached the center of the town square, directly in front of the sheriff's office. And there, waiting for them as they knew he would be, was Deputy Gideon Cole. He stood alone, his lean frame rigid, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His winter sky eyes were locked on Reese, a vortex of personal hatred and professional duty. Ford. Cole's voice was low and dangerous. I knew you were a fool. I didn't know you were suicidal. Reese swung down from shadow, his movements calm and unhurried. He helped Annalise down, and she stood beside him, not behind him. She was no longer hiding. Reese didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he held up the thick, leather-bound ledger. This isn't about you and me, Cole, Reese said, his voice carrying in the tense silence. A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the unfolding drama, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. This is about him. Reese nodded toward the mayor's office. It's about what he did to this town. To her parents. Cole's eyes flickered to the book, then back to Reese, his expression one of pure contempt. I don't care about your stories. Ford, I'm here to arrest you for the murder of Mayor Finch. He wasn't a mayor. Annalise's voice rang out, clear and strong, startling the crowd and Cole himself. He was a thief and a killer. She took a step forward, her fear burned away by righteous anger. My father, John Price, kept his real books, the ones that show how Finch stole from every single one of you. She opened the ledger. Reese stood beside her, his hand resting near his Colt, his eyes scanning the crowd, watching Cole. He was her shield, allowing her to be the sword. He took bribes from the railroad to steal water rights, she announced, her voice trembling but resolute. He forced ranchers like the Abernathys into foreclosure by manipulating cattle prices, then bought their land for pennies on the dollar. A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Abernathy, a grizzled old rancher, stared, his mouth agape. He was in business with the same outlaws he hired you to hunt. Cole, Annalise continued, her words a hammer blow. He took a cut of every rustling operation in this valley for the last 5 years. It's all here. Every date, every name, every dollar. Cole stood frozen, his world tilting, his long, bitter hunt, his righteous quest for vengeance against his brother's killer, was being dismantled in front of the entire town. He had been so blinded by his hatred for Reese that he had been serving the very rot that had likely gotten his brother killed in the first place, a world of lawlessness masquerading as order. This is why he came after me, Annalise said, her voice dropping, thick with emotion. This is why my parents are dead. He couldn't have them exposing him. He struck me and tried to force me to sign away my home. Reese Ford saved my life. The man he killed was no mayor. He was my parents' murderer. The silence that followed was absolute. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung in the air. Every eye turned to Gideon Cole. He was the law. But what was the law now? The word of a dead, corrupt politician, or the damning, handwritten proof in a dead man's ledger? His hand twitched, his fingers flexing over the handle of his gun. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire town held its breath. The future of Redemption Gulch would be decided by this single choice: a bullet born of vengeance, or a truth born of courage. Cole's gaze shifted from Reese's steady eyes to Annalise's defiant face, and then to the ledger she held like a shield. He saw the faces in the crowd, no longer just curious, but angry, betrayed. He slowly, deliberately, took his hand away from his gun. "Give me the book," he said, his voice rough with a broken man's humility. Reese watched him for a beat, then nodded to Annalise. She walked forward and placed the ledger in Gideon Cole's outstretched hands. The weight of truth had finally found its rightful place. Justice in the West, it turned out, was sometimes heavier than a gun. In the months that followed, a quiet but profound change settled over Redemption Gulch. The seasons turned, and the raw wounds of revelation began to scar over, healing into something stronger, guided by the undeniable proof in the ledger, and driven by a humbled sense of duty. Gideon Cole cleaned up the town. The corrupt officials implicated by Finch's records were removed, their power crumbling like sun-baked clay. Justice, slow and methodical, took root in the soil that had been poisoned by greed for so long. Reese and Annalise did not stay to watch. They returned to her parents' ranch, to the land blessed with a strong spring. The ghosts that had ridden with Reese for so long grew quiet there, silenced by the rhythms of honest work and the vast, peaceful expanse of the sky. The weight of the gun on his hip was replaced by the weight of an axe as he mended fences. The calloused hands that had once known only violence now learned to rebuild. He found his redemption, not in a grand, public absolution, but in the quiet, daily acts of creating a life instead of taking one. He and Annalise built their future on a foundation of shared hardship and profound respect. Their love was not a fiery passion born of impulse, but a deep, steady flame kindled in the darkest of nights, a trust forged in the face of death. They found in each other a solace that the world had denied them. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, they would stand on the porch and look out over the valley, listening to the gentle murmur of the spring. It was the sound of a promise kept, a legacy restored. The West is a land of violent endings, but it is also a land of hard-won beginnings. It remembers the gunshots and the graves, but it also remembers the quiet courage of those who dared to plant seeds of truth in its unforgiving soil, hoping for a harvest of peace